Hello again, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and we are continuing aviation in the Pacific week. And today we are looking at an aspect of it that involves complicated math, radar, science, technology, and some cool aircraft flying in the air. And we're going to Guadalcanal in kind of the middle of the Pacific War. And my guest, Trent, is an American kind of amateur but very, very thorough historian. He's part of the Section 22 Special Interest Group, and he will at some point explain just exactly what that is. But it's to do with radar and the Pacific, and it's a kind of bunch of geeks talking about really important stuff that helped win the war. So without further ado, I'll introduce Trent. He is wearing a mask because he's been exposed to COVID, protecting his family, blah, blah, blah. We can hear him okay. Just saying, it's going to be fine. So good afternoon, Trent. How are you doing?
I'm doing wonderfully well. No symptoms so far, thankfully.
Good. So, I mean, we're looking at the Guadalcanal campaign, and, you know, as soon as the word Guadalcanal comes in, people think of the kind of the battles on the rivers and the ground warfare and the beginning of that kind of island hopping. But when we talk about the Pacific, it's always the air war that the kind of, I think, gets overlooked, and particularly kind of the technology behind the air war, because aircraft don't just fly out looking for things. I mean, sometimes they do, but generally there's a bigger intelligence operation behind it. They're relying on what they know about where the enemy is going to be, and radar is one of those key things here. So that's what we're talking about today. So you have come armed with a cracking PowerPoint presentation, and I don't know very much about this subject, folks, so I'm going to hand over to Trent basically, and we are talking about the Guadalcanal Air Campaign's Horseshoe Nail of Victory. So yes, over to you, sir.
All right. The Horseshoe Nail of Victory in this presentation is one Master Technical Sergeant Dermott H. McDowell. He was a radar operator for Marine Air Group 23. And his performance with an SCR-270 radar was such that had he not been there, it's very likely that the Americans would have lost air superiority over Guadalcanal in the campaign entirely. Now, that's a huge statement. I've got to bring a whole lot of information to prove to you beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was that good, because he hasn't been included in the historiography of the Guadalcanal campaign. So I'm going to start with a passage from my 2019 article on Chicagoboyz describing him. It's damned rare when you read the histories of the Second World War that you can definitively find a place where one man with the right skills at the right place at the right time provided a make or break victory or defeat level difference in a military campaign with his contributions, let alone one so central to the identities of the United States Navy and Marine Corps as the Guadalcanal campaign. Yet from the period from September 15th, 1942 to March 8th, 1943, there was one Marine non-commissioned officer who did just that. He was Master Technical Sergeant Dermott H. McDowell. His performance as Chief Radar Operator for MAG-23 with his radar made the difference between keeping and losing daytime air superiority over Henderson Field in the darkest days of the Guadalcanal campaign. He was the Guadalcanal Air Campaign's Horseshoe Nail of Victory. Most people at one point or another have heard of Benjamin Franklin's tale, For Want of a Nail, a parable of how a lost horseshoe nail meant the loss of a kingdom in a cascade of defeat. Sergeant McDermott's performance was its opposite. It was McDowell's outstanding and innovative performance with the limited radar and its oscilloscope-derived A-scope that was the rock upon which victory in the air was built at Guadalcanal. There are several books that mention Sergeant MacDonnell. The best known history is John Lundstrom's The First Team in the Guadalcanal Campaign, which he mentions McDonnell twice by name in the book. The more recent Radar and Fighter Directors by David Broslaw, Captain U.S. Navy retired, also mentioned him. However, the author that did the best in describing what McDonnell did at Guadalcanal was United States Air Force historian John Kreese in his 1988 monograph, Air Warfare and Air-Based Defense, 1914 to 1973. The following two passages are from his book, or monograph. Finally, Defense Battalion, the 3rd Marine Defense Battalion's SCR-270B radar was installed before Henderson Field's fighters arrived. Another SCR-270B went into service on September 15th. It was assigned to the Marine Air Wing's Fighter Direction Center under the control of Master Technical Sergeant Dermott H. MacDonnell, who became, in his own right, one of the keys for air defense over the island. This is a passage from a little later. On 8 October, Lieutenant Lewis Masterson and Ensign W.A. Knoll, both naval officers sent from the U.S. Navy's Fighter Direction School at Pearl Harbor, arrived on Guadalcanal. There they found two rudimentary radar air search operations. One was the 1st Marine Air Wing's fighter controllers. The other was the 3rd Defense Battalions. The two search efforts at first were not integrated and not always mutually supporting, although there was contact between them. Moreover, the early radar sets were not very reliable and reported false returns from the surrounding mountains and hills. Sergeant McDonnell was often the only man who could interpret the zigzag lines on the oscilloscope and tell how many airplanes were in the attacking formation. Lieutenant Matson gave much of the credit for the radar success to Sergeant Dermott McDowell, who would tell from the radar's A-scope not only how many aircraft were in the formation, but could also frequently identify medium bombers, dive bombers, fighters, or long-range seaplanes. McDonnell was the harried commander's dream who specialized in getting around the shortcomings of his equipment. For example, radar operators could get a range and bearing of approaching raids on the SCR-270, but had to wait for the enemy to come within 25 miles before the Marine Defense Battalion's SCR-268 searchlight radars gave them an accurate altitude reading. The sergeant knew that the 270's frame was tiltable 10 degrees backwards, so the antenna could be adjusted for terrain contour when installed. He used these features to take two readings on target, one with the antenna perpendicular and the other with the antenna slightly reclined. With these, he could calculate the approximate altitude. Fighters were then vectored and waiting above that level when the Japanese arrived. Now, let's go to the next slide. All right. To bring the credible evidence for those preceding passages, not only will math be employed, but we're going to visit solar physics, ionosphere prediction, electromagnetic theory, 1930s radio navigation, anti-aircraft doctrine, and 1942 radar technical capabilities. Next slide.
Phew is my comment to that. Phew, there's a lot of stuff we're going to cover, but it's really important. So yeah, we're going to learn a lot, folks. I can feel it in my bones.
All right. Now we're looking at Sergeant McDonnell's office. If you can go to the right side and make it closer. That arrow going to that screen in the middle of the black box on the left of your screen is the oscilloscope screen. That was what McDonnell was staring at during the course of the campaign. Can you back out a little? In the center of the screen, you see a circle with some squiggly lines. That was what he was looking at. That was what he used to determine what was coming at the Marines in October of 1942. Now, next slide. All right, the group of men that you see on the right is his crew on that radar. I have all their names. I have all their faces. I can't match one to the other. Sorry. Right. The people who supported McDonnell were PFC Taylor and 8 privates. H.D. Nichols, Robert Schultz, Julius Jones, W.M. Urillo, C.L. Dill, G.C. Donnell, H.M. Woolley, and Franklin T. Rainier. These were the guys that scrambled on the radar and popped it back so he can do his deeds. What you're looking at on the left is the actual radar that they worked on. That is a photograph of that radar in its position on Guadalcanal. And if you look to the left of the picture, you'll see a mound. That's his office. It's a truck covered by a camouflage net. Next slide, please. That's what an SCR-270 looked like when it was being sent on the road. There were 4 trucks carrying all the equipment, and the whole mass weighed about 60 tons. This is why, despite landing on 7 August 1942 on Guadalcanal, This radar didn't arrive and get set up until September 15th. In the upper left is the crew, a crew working on the radar, tilting it back. So you can see how they did the work. Let's back out a little and go to the lower right. Those rods that you see underneath the trailer could also be moved back and forth to help tilt the antenna. I do not know which method that McDonnell's guys were using to tilt the antenna back. I can just tell you that they did. Let's go to the next slide. All right, now I got to give some context, and this is where things get really deep into electromagnetic spectrum operations. That is, how people use radio to transmit data and to sense things. And specifically, this is to explain why the Japanese were able to show up over Guadalcanal so effectively and efficiently day and night throughout the campaign. And it all goes back to a gentleman that you should all be familiar with, Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto was the chief of the technical division of the Naval Air Corps from 1929 to 1934. This was when Japan went from a technological power that copied to a peer power that innovated with technology. And he did this innovation for a specific reason. The Kentai Kessen doctrine, the decisive battle doctrine is the general translation used in English, was about winning a decisive battle with the American fleet in the event of war, or the British fleet for that matter, which is what I think Admiral Yamamoto used. Essentially, the problem that the Japanese fleet had was it had lots of battle cruiser missions, and it only had 2 battle cruisers, and the Washington Navy Treaty meant it wasn't going to get more. So Isoroku Yamamoto used that as a wedge in Japanese budget fights inside the Imperial Japanese Navy to create a land-based torpedo bomber force. And he used the Royal Navy's Special Service Squadron visitation through the Pacific in 1923 and 1924 as the measuring against which that he built that force. That the Repulse was both part of this squadron and in Force Z, which was destroyed by these naval torpedo bombers in early 1942, is a testament to Yamamoto's ability to build a command, control, and communication equipped system that rivaled that of Hugh Dowding. But while Dowding's system was a shield, Yamamoto's was a sword. Next slide, please. All right. The Japanese didn't get as good as they were in 1942 without a whole lot of development and combat. One of the things that popped out through my communications with Justin Pike. He's a YouTube content creator who works with both Guinea and with a military aviation history, was that the Japanese started doing night flight pay in 1932. Justin Pike provided me a link to a USC online series of documents, which were the 5th Marine Regiment in Shanghai describing how the Japanese were evolving in their fight against the Chinese. And there was an incident in 1938, and then war broke out in 1937. And these intelligence units were reporting on how things were going. What you see at right is in the lower right corner is the first generation of torpedo bombers that were a result of Admiral Yamamoto's effort, the Nell. It was an extremely long-range aircraft, and it was used to fight in China. Let's back out a little.
Yep.
In 3 operations that resulted in the destruction of Force Z. These operations were Operation 100, 101, and 102. And the Chinese had to fight a Japanese attack coming from Formosa to Chongqing. This was about 550 miles, or about 900 kilometers. And the Japanese learned how to use radio beacons to fly not only day but at night, and to integrate fighters into their attacks on Chongqing. Next slide, please. This is an apples to apples comparison of how good the Japanese were after 2 years of fighting compared to the Bomber Command. And Bomber Command on the 18th of August 1941 said in a report on the bombing to date, conclusion seems to be that the following, that only about 1/3 of aircraft claiming to reach their target actually reached it. Whereas on the right is an eyewitness report from a Russian fighter pilot who was working with the Chinese. The Japanese bombers appeared over Chongqing on moonlit nights when they could easily see major landmarks. From time to time, the commander of the formation called on all bombers to open up in a defensive barrage in a general direction likely used by attacking fighters. The performance was effective, and it was a gigantic broom of fire sweeping the sky. So let me unpack that. The Chinese used searchlight guided night fighters over Nanking and later over Chongqing. The Japanese developed not only flew in formations accurately at night for months, they were also doing defensive fire against night fighters. Two things from this. The Germans didn't get around to searchlight-driven night fighters until 1942, and the Chinese were doing that in 1937, and the Japanese were more effective in 1939 combating this sort of thing than were the British in 1941. Next slide.
And that is something, because as a Brit, we are immensely proud of our radar network in 1940-41. We talk about it with glowing terms, and it's kind of interesting to be reminded that perhaps it wasn't quite the wonder of the world that we thought it was.
All right. Now we are at my slide 9, explaining the sword that was the Yamamoto C3I system. Japanese radio beacon technology married aerial, ship, and ground-based direction finding sensors. Plus, they laid a grid map on the ocean. And this is important because you have to be able to tell the aircraft that you want to concentrate on a target where to go on the ocean. Well, if everyone had the radio direction find equipment and a map, they could navigate to that grid without making any further radio transmissions. They can come in silent. Western allies were unaware of the full extent of this grid mapping until the Marianas were overrun in the summer of 1944. That's when Admiral Nagumo's naval headquarters was overrun and the grid maps were found. And let's go to the right-hand corner. This is one of the reports from Mark Zulo's rooftop gang, the mobile radio intelligence people that were in the aircraft carriers listening to Japanese search planes. You'll see colored there the word grid 3 times. I went through the 3 of the, can we back out a little? The special research histories on Ultra that were with the NSA. And by textual search, I counted 854 times where Japanese snooper planes looking for US carriers made calls, grid calls of locations back to headquarters to tell Japanese attack planes where American carriers were. Next slide. Now we get into some really interesting and not generally known stuff about radio in World War II. The map that you see there was done by the American government after World War II. And if you close in over Australia, all right, what you see there are a series of squiggly lines that go from 1 to 5. The squiggly area that is over northern Australia, the Solomons, and Rabaul is what I refer to as the Great South Pacific radiostatic blob. It turns out the magnetic fields of the Earth are not uniform. And there are some areas where there's just a whole lot more static. Now let's back out. And go to the right and low. And what you're looking at here is a cockpit of a Zero that was shot down over Hawaii and came down pretty much in one piece. This has all the radio and radar direction finding equipment that was standard equipment on the A6M Zero. The problem with it is when the Japanese built this fighter, the chief designer for the Zero was extremely interested in reducing weight to improve performance. So when he had the aircraft built, he ordered the radio and engine engineers to not put in shielding so he could save the weight. Well, the problem with that is while his radio could work in ones and twos on that map, when he went into a place like the Great South Pacific radiostatic blob, all the guys in the airplanes were getting in an 8-hour flight to and from Guadalcanal was static. Now, you've got men that fight for their lives, that are sweating in a glass house in the middle of the tropics, and all they're eating through their earphones is static. This, the fighter pilots in the Tannen Air Group at Rabaul simply tore the radios out because they were useless to them. The radiostatic bomb also made its strength felt with radio calls over Guadalcanal. In Germany and over France and in the Mediterranean, German radios of equivalent strength could go out to 125 miles. That's 200 kilometers. Radios at Guadalcanal in high frequency only went out to 50 miles, 80 kilometers. So the fighter direction at Guadalcanal simply could not send out fighters long distance to do intercepts. They had to do them right over the airfield where their radios could reach their fighters. Now, let's go to the upper right. All right, when I talked earlier about the beacons, this is the math by which the Japanese used the maps. That is, what you're seeing is a person with a radio direction finder takes a direction. He takes out a time watch at a known speed, and he clicks 60 seconds or 2 minutes. Any multiple of minutes, he divides by 60 against his known speed, and he has a distance traveled. That's the bottom of the triangle. Then he takes a second direction cut. And by using the math that you see here, he determines where he is on the grid map, and he can call out where that is to forces behind him to come attack. Let's go to the next slide. Let's go to the left, and I want you to see that large scale. And I want to explain the genius, and I'm crediting genius to Admiral Ernest King. When he made the Navy attack Guadalcanal, what he took out was also the Tulagi seaplane base for the Japanese. If you look on the map, you'll see a G and an F search sector. Those were done by seaplanes from that base. That base also had a non-directional radio beacon. Let's go to the right side. All right. The center of all those circles is Guadalcanal. All right. Every one of those circles is 50 miles. The radars on the SCR-270s on Guadalcanal could see 130 miles. That was between the second and third circles there. That's as far as Dermott McDowell could see with his radars. And you'll note that when can you draw back? The distance from Guadalcanal to Henderson Field is 565 miles one way. The Japanese were doing escorted bombing raids in 1942 in a way that the United States Army Air Force did not match until February 1944. They were using drop tanks. They were using long of lean fuel management techniques that enabled their plane to fly at that distance every day, every day, every day, in a way that it would take another 2 years for the Army Air Force to match. That's a distance from London to Berlin. Next slide. This was what was punched out when the Marines came ashore at Guadalcanal. They took out also a large number of Mavis flying boats that you see there, and Roof, which were Zero fighters with floats. By doing this, they took out those search sectors that you saw earlier. Now, next slide. Strategically, that was incredibly, incredibly important. What you're seeing there are the tracks of the two contending fleets in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons and the Battle of Santa Cruz. By taking Guadalcanal and taking out Tulagi, the American Navy created a safe zone where its carriers could operate outside the radio beacon range of Japanese search planes. This enabled them to operate secretly such that the Japanese carriers had to find them, and it put them on equal footing in the carrier battles that followed. Next slide. All right, this is... All right. This is an extremely important slide for a couple of reasons. In the lower left, what you're looking at is a Type 92 105 millimeter cannon. It is actually a gun. That is, it has more than 50 calibers on its barrel, and it could reach out 18 kilometers. On October 3rd and October 8th, 1942, the Japanese seaplane carrier Nishin delivered these guns and this ammunition to Guadalcanal. On the 13th, they started shelling Henderson Strip. Can we get a close in on Henderson?
Yep.
All right. If you look at the right hand and you see the blue line, that was the edge of the perimeter. The Japanese could see from the edge of the perimeter right down Henderson Field. They had someone, an observer there with a radio, who was calling in artillery fire on American aircraft, which is why they all moved over to the fighter strip. Let's back up a little. This is the reason I bring this in is I've got to point out to you on what a knife's edge this entire campaign was built on. Had the Japanese gotten in more artillery and more shells for those guns, they could very well have done more than just move stuff from one strip to the other. Next slide.
No, I'm just to let you have a breath for your voice. I can really see, as we're getting into this now, the kind of the horseshoe analogy there, because it's lots of little things that maybe individually don't seem terribly important, but in something as complicated as this, add them all together, and you've got situations that are actually influencing the outcome of essentially everything.
Yes. Now, remember when I used John Kreese's text, and he talked about how McDowell was finding the altitude? Let's go to the right and look at the slant range formula. All right. Where you see cosine of the angle equals r ground over r slant, you're looking at, and then look at the radar antenna. Basically, McDowell was computing the range from the just leaving it straight, and then when it was tilted back, let's back up a little, and then he was using slide rules to give him the quick formulas to do the quick determination of the altitudes for the fighters that he fed to the Fighter Direction Center, and put American F-4F Wildcat fighters in an advantageous situation so they could make one slashing attack on Japanese bombers before the Japanese fighters could react. And since Japanese fighters didn't have radios, there was no real good coordination between the Japanese fighters and bombers. It was just what the fighters could see and visually signal with hands or lights to one another. And once you get into turning combat, that falls apart quick. All right, next. And oh, by the way, I got to make a call out The slide rules came from research on the Otred Society's website and the International Slide Rule Museum's website. All right, now, this is where we get into electromagnetic theory. The zero there that you see there is in a Chutai formation. It was an intermediate building block for Japanese fighter formations. All right. On the right side, you see the Shotai, the Chutai, and the Daitai formations. And I've got to do some explaining here before we get into electromagnetic theory. The Japanese looked like they were using something like the RAF Vic during during the Battle of Britain. It wasn't. The Japanese combat in China taught them that the Vic was not a useful formation in real combat. So what they did was they loosened it up. Their fighters behind them were at higher altitudes than the lead and to the left and the right. And they moved back and forth, trying to look around since it was predominantly a visual formation.
Yep.
Now let's get and look in that white box. All right, now electromagnetic theory. I'm not going to get into numbers. I'm just going to show you pictures. Basically, anywhere there is a 90-degree angle, the radar signal goes in and it comes right back. So if you have got a large formation of aircraft that are moving back and forth, you're showing different aspects of the airplane. So the radar return jiggles. It bounces up and down. That earlier oscilloscope screen that I showed you, the peak bounced up and down. And McDowell figured this out in about the second week of October. Now, let's back this out and go to the next slide. What that meant in practice was simple. The Zero was the fastest of the aircraft in the Japanese formations. Vowels were slower than Bettys. Bettys were slower than Zeros. And Mavis flying boats were the slowest of all with the biggest radar signatures. What that meant was that McDowell could tell from the speed of the blip coming at him, or they actually called it PIP at the time,
right?
What aircraft was coming towards Guadalcanal. And if it had a bouncing return associated with it, he could tell whether the fighters were there escorting the aircraft or not, and he could pass this on to the Fighter Direction Center. He identified the size of the force by how tall the blip was. So he could say, 20, more than 50. And he could also send fighters off to chase off flying boats to give that shield of area where the Japanese couldn't send the flying boats to look for American aircraft. Next slide.
I wonder if it's time to field a question, and I'm
right.
going to read this out without actually knowing what it means myself.
Okay.
Because, Peter O'Connell is saying, could the old-style cactus radar antenna rotate? Otherwise, how did the operator determine target bearings using the 2D oscilloscope screen? Wow, that's yeah.
Right. I understand what he's saying, so we're all good. The oscilloscope screen just told you how tall or how powerful the return was in its range. It didn't tell you the azimuth. There was a separate screen on the display that I showed earlier that gave the azimuth as the antenna rotated round and round. This let McDowell know approximately the azimuth with which the Japanese were coming from. And all right, I've got to do some explaining of a couple charts here and one specific action that occurred in late October. Let's go to the right-hand side. This is a pie chart from anti-aircraft activities of the Pacific War. It was a U.S. Army report that was done in early 1946 that consolidated all anti-aircraft activity in World War II. And they had a chapter on Guadalcanal. What you see here is a pie chart showing 92 attacks for which the altitude was known, and what percentage of the altitudes of those 92 attacks occurred. Most occurred over 20,000 feet. A large number, 20%, a fifth, were between 10,000 and 2,000 feet. And there were at least 9 attacks where Japanese came down and strafed. Can we back up a little? The 3rd Marine Defense Battalion recorded 82 air raids by November, middle of, and this campaign lasted until February. So basically that pie chart leaves out a whole lot of attacks for which there's no recorded altitude. But the one thing, if you look at the bar up top, 86% of the attacks for which they had altitude happened at night, and only almost a little under 4% happened during the day. This was primarily due to McDonnell's getting Japanese, arranging for Wildcats to hit the Japanese with a high altitude advantage. The Marine guns of the 3rd Defense Battalion helped in driving the Japanese to a higher altitude, but while that was resistance, it wasn't a real defense. I'll explain that in a minute. And the reason I'm showing this particular bombing raid on the 24th and 25th of October was the rain mudded out the fighter strip. The Japanese had a free shot with no fighters, and they plastered the airfield. It was the integrated air defense that kept the airfields from getting plastered. Next slide.
Another couple of questions for you. Again, we can address them now or later. One, Chris is asking about whether the humidity on Guadalcanal affected any of the components in any of these gadgets.
Yes. There was a major redesign effort, and there were callbacks to Nomiya to fly in parts in flying boats. The documents that I read said that they did a whole lot of work on this radar during the course of the campaign, and things like humidity and fungus were a major factor in the operational capability of the radar. All right,
super.
You got another question?
And the Grant Dominion is asking about the minimum detection altitude. Obviously, the night raids are happening at high altitude. Was there an issue of anyone coming in low?
There was a minimum altitude with which this aircraft, basically anything that got below a few thousand feet was problematic for this radar, given its wavelength. It was a 3-meter band radar. This worked for seeing aircraft, in particular aircraft propellers, because most propellers were about 3 meters in diameter, and that was very useful because it was the bandwidth of the radar, and it fluoresced on the screen. Anyway, I've got to explain air defense doctrine to explain why McDowell was so important. On the left and right hand side, you see a point in an area air defense. All right, World War II air defense was about bomb release lines. World War II bomb release line was based on the fact that an attacking aircraft would take evasive action before and after entering a bomb run. Anti-aircraft guns had to be located so that they can fire on an aircraft while it was doing its straight and level bomb run during the period of time needed to actually aim at a point or an area target. The need to maintain a maximum rate of fire at the end of the bomb run required the AA guns to be pushed back from that bomb release line so they could go up at a 75-degree angle, which was the maximum elevation they could reach at maximum firing. What that meant was, because the Marine 3rd Defense Battalion had a limited perimeter, it couldn't follow this doctrine. Let's next slide. And that was a problem for a number of reasons. McDonnell's nighttime nemesis was Washing Machine Charlie. It was a Betty bomber with a limited payload and lots of fuel that was flying down, and yes, it dropped bombs, but what it was doing was trailing its coat to get the Marines to transmit, so the Japanese listeners on other islands could find out things about the garrison. Yes, it kept the Marines awake, but that really wasn't its primary mission. And the reason it was called Washing Machine Charlie was the Japanese detuned the engine, so they weren't synchronized. They sounded awful. It sounded like a badly balanced washing machine. The reason was they were trying to beat, if you look at the lower right-hand corner, Well, that's the left-hand quarter, but that's fine. You're looking there at a Model 2 aircraft high Mark 1 direction finder. That was the United States Naval Intelligence, when they captured them, tagged them as a copy of a German Telefunken radio direction finder. When I went looking for it, there were no German pieces of direction finding gear that operated in the frequencies of this piece of kit. Let's go to the other side of the screen. All right, the reason that the Japanese detuned the engines were they were trying to beat detectors like this. What you're looking at is a Japanese Type 90 sound locator. Basically, someone put earphones into their ear, and they could tell which sides, whether they were looking up, down, sideways, and generate an azimuth to shoot guns. Let's go large again. It wasn't very effective, but by making the two engines sound different, as they did, they beat them. Now let's go to the upper right. The thing about the Japanese radio beacons is they went much farther at night because of the ionosphere. That is, on the frequencies the beacons worked, they reached out farther at night. So the Japanese had a longer range which they could use that technical capability to find things. This is why the Japanese were able to show up at night every night over Guadalcanal. Now, sometimes the weather got too bad, but it was the radio beacon system that enabled the Japanese to go there and back time and time again and not get lost. Next slide. Now, what you are looking at is Louis the Louse. It was a Mitsubishi F1M Type 0 observation seaplane. These operated both from the island of Brune and from Japanese battleship and cruisers. Every major nighttime bombardment had one of these flying over Guadalcanal, dropping flares, so the Japanese could see where the battleship and cruiser guns were impacting. That's why the bombardment is talked about in quotations by the Marines, because one of these were up there dropping flares, radio in corrections for the 14-inch guns that worked over Henderson Field. And the problem with both of these aircraft is they weren't coming from a known azimuth. They were coming outside the normal track and showing up over Guadalcanal, and they were too close for McDonnell to do his radar trick that we talked about earlier. Now, next slide.
And do you want another couple of questions we had? Dean Murphy is asking about, simple one, were the Japanese aware of the American radar on Guadalcanal?
Maybe. The problem is they really didn't do things that were consistent with trying to take it out. That is,
right.
The bombardment with that 105 millimeter gun could have, I think, targeted that radar up on a hill, but it didn't. So the answer is they may have known it's there, but they didn't really know how it affected operations, and they most specifically did not know about McDonnell.
Right.
All right. Do we have any other questions?
No, I think we're good.
All right. Now I'm going to give you the biography of McDonnell. McDonnell was born 16 August 1921. He received the Silver Star for gallantry under fire at Henderson Field. The picture you see there, center, is General Roy Geiger. He awarded the Navy Cross to Colonel Cooley, far left, and the Silver Star to Master Technical Sergeant Dermott McDowell, center. Anyway, getting back to the biography, McDowell left Guadalcanal on the 8th of March, 1943. He returned to the United States after Guadalcanal, and he received a commission. He was sent to become a radar instructor at MCAS Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point. And for a year, he trained all of the Marines radar operators that were sent to the Pacific. As the radar program wound down and there weren't any more radars needed, he was trained as a fighter director and was part of Marine Air Warning Squadron 6 at Okinawa. He stayed in the Marine Corps after World War II and married Margaret Nugel in Washington, D.C. in March of 1946. He had two children, two girls, Aileen and Kathleen, were born at Bethesda Naval Hospital. McDonnell served as a company commander in the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion during the Korean War and served with great distinction. In 1957, he was deployed to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, as the executive officer shortly after Fidel Castro took over the country. After retirement, he moved his family to Burlington, Massachusetts, where he and a veteran colleague began a company working with electronics and weaponry for the U.S. government. During that period, he also got Aileen to join the U.S. Naval Nurse Corps and was the one to swear her in, and she served from 1967 to 1972. Like many companies in the Boston area, once the Vietnam War wound down, McDonnell's company folded in the early 70s, and he went into full retirement and moved to Amherst. McDonnell died 10 April 1976 in the Northampton, Massachusetts VA hospital, and is buried at Lawrence, Massachusetts. All right. So why don't we know about this man if he did so much? I mean, besides 2 footnotes in a couple of books. Next slide. This is where we get into politics memory and why we don't know about him. The 2 books that you see there, the Guadalcanal Campaign, written shortly after the war, and the 50th anniversary, the book on the aces of the Guadalcanal Campaign, neither one of them mention McDonnell. There are reasons for this. Institutional history is at best a first draft, and at worst, it's lying. And by lying, I mean lies of omission having to do with intelligence sources and methods. The Japanese grid map system used in World War II was darkly in the nested. You know how the Russians have a nested doll where you pull tops off and there's smaller and smaller dolls within? Well, Ultra is a very small doll in the center of the larger doll of history. And you have to get down to that doll to really know what is going on in the history. Plus, technical capabilities of radars were a lesser level of classified. So neither of those books dealt with any of the information we talked about. Next slide. The thing about institutional history is not only do you have sources and methods, there's also a lot of money and power reasons in the background affecting what goes into the history. And what you're seeing here is the politicians that were the left and right hands, the money and power operating in the histories. And we're going to start the 5 politicians who fought during the war and after and resulted in McDonnell disappearing from our historical record were Admiral Ernest King, center, Admiral William Halsey, left, General Robert Richardson, right, upper, and left and right lower are the 16th and 17th Commandants of the United States Marine Corps, Lieutenant General Thomas Holcomb and Lieutenant Alexander Vandergrift, who was the commander of the 1st Marine Division during Guadalcanal Campaign. And when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled is a short part of an African parable. It goes as follows. When elephants fight, no matter what else happens, the grass gets trampled. If you're grass, you get trampled. And Dermott McDowell was the grass in this particular case. Next slide. We got to get a little bit into the politics of the founding of the Department of Defense and the fight for the Marine Corps' survival within that context. Everything that you know about the modern Marine Corps service brand comes from Vandergrift and Holcomb. And this was in part to make sure when the merger of the Navy and War Department happened, the Marine Corps survived as an independent service. And the brand that we know, the Marine Corps today, the Marine Corps is an amphibious air-ground team that it's the export and close air support. Marine naval aviation operates from U.S. Navy carriers. The Marine Corps doesn't do factions, and the Marine Corps does more with less. All comes from those 2 men. And in particular, General Vandergrift was absolutely ruthless in making this branding stick, to the point where he took the 2-star general in charge of Marine Corps Aviation, and he sent him to Argentina because he was not with the program on close air support and putting U.S. Marine fighters and tactical aircraft on naval carriers. Next.
Well, I'm just going to interject a little bit here because I just want to add a little bit of context as well. I mean, towards the end of World War II, all sorts of units are fighting for their place in history,
Yes.
and they're fighting for their continuing presence within an ever-changing military. And so an example, even I know from Normandy, is the 2nd Rangers, who famously fought at Pointe du Hoc. If you go online, folks, and you download the small unit action report that's available on all sorts of websites, I think it's a 72-page report of their exploits at Pointe du Hoc. It's an edited version of the one they actually first produced, which I have a copy of, which is, I think, off memory serves, is 95 pages. Like 23 pages of this mimeograph were edited out. And I got my copy from Sandhurst as it goes. And basically, the Rangers are fighting for their existence. You know, the army's reducing inside, the military, blah, blah, blah. And they just edit the version to omit things that they don't think present their story the way going forward, things that just need to be just sidelined. So I think, I mean, this is a small unit. We're talking about the U.S. Marine Corps here, but, you know, when I'm referencing Chesty Puller and the flag raising and, you know, the things like that, this will ensure a Marine Corps for the next 200 years or something is what he said, isn't it? There's all sorts of reasons why stories are needed to be kept at the forefront and other stories perhaps shouldn't be kept at the forefront. And now, 70 plus years later, when we tackle the historiography, we're now, as you are now, Trent, looking at and saying, this is a story that should be in. And now is, I guess, the time to put these stories back in.
Well, absolutely right. I mean, like I said, it's like those nested Russian dolls. The more that you pull apart, the more that you find within. And part of all of that Marine Corps politicking was having to deal with the organizational politics of radar in World War II. Radar was a brand new technology. Every military service was building empires just like the Rangers. You know, they were using radar and not being an infantry unit, mind you, but they were trying to survive. There were Navy ground-based radar. There was Army ground-based radar. There was Marine ground-based radar. They were all doing versions of the same job. And some of the radars controlled fighter planes. Some of the radars directed guns. And some of those guns shot at airplanes, and some of those guns shot at ships. There were at least 7 or 8 different kinds of ground-based radar units in the Pacific. And there was a coming merger. So a lot of these units were going to go away. The Marine Corps Defense Battalion evolved during the course of the war, and it evolved for a number of reasons. The coast defense function was not needed because the Navy won the Sea War. So the Defense Battalion became an anti-aircraft battalion. The problem is you can't really do anti-aircraft well on a postage stamp of an island. You can provide resistance, but you can't do that bomb line defense that I showed you earlier. And in doing the history of the Pacific campaigns, that was edited out. What you're seeing here, by the way, is on the right is one of those SCR-286 radars. That is its actual position on Guadalcanal. You see how it's dug in?
Yeah.
These radars were getting shelled. You wouldn't see that unless there were fragments flying around. Let's back out a little. What you see in the left-hand picture is where the guns, the 90 millimeter guns of the 3rd Defense Battalion were protecting Henderson Field from. Now let's back out again. The Marine Corps' less than stellar anti-aircraft defense of Guadalcanal had consequences. Next slide. Admiral Halsey preferred U.S. naval land-based radar. Most of those operations that you see on the left had U.S. Navy ground-based radar units involved. He much preferred them. This was bad for the Marine Corps, especially after Vandergrift came on board in 1944 as the commandant. He had to get marine land-based radar be the primary radar for the Navy Department if the Marine Corps and Marine Corps aviation was to survive into the post-war world. Next slide, please. And this is where politics intervened on the side of the Marine Corps. We talked in our Section 22 stream about the Canberra Pact. Admiral Halsey reached out to the New Zealanders to get radars for his Argus units because the North African campaign had priority. The New Zealanders built 6 radars called long-range air warning radars, which were used by Halsey's Argus units. But the problem is, in January 1944, New Zealand and Australia got together and said, you, the United States, should get the hell out of the South Pacific and leave our front yard to Australia and New Zealand. To say that this did not go over well with Admiral Ernest King is to say, water is wet. Mm-hmm. So I want a sidebar. Look in the upper right-hand corner. These are for Australia or New Zealand physicists. The second one from the left is our friend R.S. Unwin, who later became the head of Field Unit 13 of Section 22. Let's back out. Because these physicists were bringing the radars in and Admiral King didn't like what happened, the Argus units were sidelined and their role and mission was given to the United States Marine Corps. This was something Vandergrift took advantage of when the information came into Washington, D.C. about this pact. Next slide. Now, the gentleman on the right, Richardson, was the hatchet man for the War Department to go after the United States Marine Corps. He was on the wrong end of the Smith versus Smith controversy, wherein Howling Mad Smith Center relieved Army General Julius Smith left. And to say that he was utterly angry at the United States Navy and was going to go out of his way to act against the Navy's interests is also like saying water is wet. In December of 1944, there was a congressional fact-finding tour for the merger of the War and Navy Department into the Defense Department. And the text that you see there in black and white is his testimony before the committee. Marine aviation as such should be, in my judgment, abolished, as every mission which aviation could be called upon to perform can be accomplished either by fleet aviation, aviation integrated into the Army organization, or by the Air Force. One of the greatest duplications of this war has been the development of marine aviation. The central strategy of Vandergrift to get the Marine Corps into the Department of Defense was to keep marine aviation. So he was doing everything possible to keep not only radar but his aviation assets going. And next slide. This is where, and I think the most important thing that happened in seeing McDonnell disappear from the historical record. In the Battle of Savo Island, the destroyers Ralph Talbot and USS Blue were doing a racetrack pattern. You'll see the upper left in the white box and map to the right. These weren't coordinated, and their radars were fixed on the front part of the destroyer. They didn't look all the way around. So one was going south and the other was going north when the Japanese force went through. And the USS Chicago in the Southern Force wasn't turning on its radar but once every half hour. And it turned on its radar at such a time that the Japanese were beyond its range and then closed into firing range before it turned its radar on again. Now, next slide. What that did, that failure to effectively screen the cruiser force, discredited RAF, Royal Navy, and United States Army Air Force sector search radar techniques that were taught to Master Technical Sergeant Dermott McDowell as he was trained. So what the Navy did was it created an extra set of radars for fighter direction ships to do that sort of sector screening that you see at right in this slide. But it did not allow in the PAC-10 doctrine any destroyer to concentrate its radar in one place. Putting all the information of how McDonnell did his thing on Guadalcanal would throw a lot of shade at that doctrine. Next slide. And this is important for a reason, because, and this is where I'm going to throw in some Australians, the coast watchers, you'll see in that map, all the locations where all the coast watchers were that were providing early warning before the Japanese got into radar range. McDonnell was using the search sector technique based on, okay, I know where a coast watcher is, and I know the approximate speed that he gave us, so I can work out when they're going to get into radar range and start sector searching at the absolute 130-mile edge of my range, so I can get that data to my fighters as soon as possible and get them to altitude. The radar only gave about 30 minutes warning, and it took that long for the fighters to get to altitude. McDowell had to get that data, and he was doing that technique. The problem is PAC-10 in February of 1944 became USF-10A, which was issued out of General Ernest King's office. That's when the radar doctrine for the U.S. fleet got locked in concrete. And anything that questioned that was bad for the U.S. Marine Corps. So this is when Vandergrift went on bended knee to Ernest King to get the Marine Corps' aviation included into the Navy Department. And that's when Dermott McDowell's history here went into the secret intelligence round file until now. So I hope that you found this of interest.
Definitely, yeah. Are we kind of?
Yes, this is the end.
This is I'm still just dealing with all this stuff now. I mean, amazing stuff, Trent. And it's the two strands that you brought us. One is the incredible story, and two, the fact the incredible story had been lost, because it's really important. Now, at the time, I mean, you obviously focused on the technology on this particular story here. Were there any other references from pilots or anybody else there? Because about this story, has it come up in any other kind of just in reference here and there?
Basically, it has been a footnote in a couple of books. And the only reason I know all of this story is I know some people in the Marine Corps that keep the torch of Marine radar in World War II, and they forwarded me the documents that were in the footnotes. I went off and did, finding things like the slide rules and electromagnetic theory on my own to try and explain what John Krish was telling me. So yes, like the gentleman that you put up there, I went sleuthing. And Schulte Torda, I can't pronounce his name, the gentleman that did the Red Army's artillery, made an extremely important point that we're in this new internet age. There's a lot of granular information that is available for being incorporated in the histories of World War II. And by adding the electromagnetic part, by adding the politics, we give a much richer and much deeper and completely different understanding of something that we thought we knew.
Right.
And this presentation was to show basically what he did in the electromagnetic form in the Pacific.
Super. We'll just deal with a couple more questions. So, Sloop John B, that's one of my favorite songs there, Sloop John B. Is McDowell did he have real-time access to Coast Watcher communications?
The answer is apparently yes. That's how he was able to do things, because he was part of the Fighter Direction Center. And when the Fighter Direction Center came up saying, Coast Watchers say incoming planes, he started doing efforts based on that notification. And the people in the Fighter Direction Center knew where the Coast Watchers were, so they could, when he gave a time, Coast Watcher says this far out, he can work that backwards to know which one and where.
Right.
Anyway, go ahead. Next question.
Next question, Peter O'Connell again, is somewhat belated, but how was the target bearing and altitude data sent from the radar shack to the anti-aircraft battery gun layers and timing fuse setters?
All right. This is a little complicated because the artillery directors for the 90mm guns did not take information directly from the SCR 268s. They shared the 1st Fighter Wing and the 3rd Marine Defense Battalion shared radio telephones, so they were sharing information on what's going on in the air, but the predominantly optical optical range finding was used by the 90mm guns to do all that information that the question talked about.
Super. And to bring things to an end, and I know what you're going to say to this already, is there are obviously more things to uncover with regards to the use of radar and beyond that, the technology of war in the Pacific theater. And I'm guessing specifically to do with the U.S. Marine Corps because of the reasons you've stated. So I know you're part of your group there. So, I mean, you said this in the last show, but what are you and your buddies there attempting to do? I mean, you're not just trying to find this stuff out for the sake of it. You're trying to find out to share it. So,
yes.
So what's your reason behind it? Why do you think we should know more about this technological aspect of the battle?
Well, the important thing here is to note that air superiority is not just fighter planes shooting each other up.
Yeah.
All right. The difference between World War I and World War II was radio. Using the radios to net together sensors and people and ground observers and getting the information to the guy on the bleeding edge, in this case, the fighter pilots, so that they could get up there and do their thing and win. And you can't really understand the air war without understanding the command and control, communications and intelligence that's behind the fighters.
Yeah. And I guess the other point is that we all collectively, and I'm including myself in this, we do still get distracted by the shiny stuff.
Yes.
You know, the fighter actions and commandos and paratroopers and torpedoes from submarines. We are drawn to the kind of exciting, dare I say, sexy stuff. And to understand this next layer of stuff, particularly when, as you said, we've brought into electromagnets and radar and math, you've got to go to another level of knowledge and be able to explain that. So as we had Dr. Kit Chapman explaining some of the science only at a basic level behind the atomic bombs in 1945, you've got to go to that level and kind of explain stuff. And essentially, we all know that we like just reading stories about brave fighter pilots climbing up into the skies and shooting down people because we think we understand it, I suppose, is the simple thing there.
Well, the thing that really strikes me is the Marine Corps spent a lot of time talking about Sergeant Brasselone. He won an engagement with a machine gun.
Yeah.
But it couldn't talk about the Marine that won the air campaign with math.
Yeah.
And if you're going to talk to people, I mean, as far as educating people to the importance of math, this is a story that you can educate with. If I were a Marine recruiter today, I would be using this story to try and get those people that are good with computers to come into the Marine Corps and do all the things that you need to do in modern war. I view this as not only doing good history, but it's also a lesson on the importance of math in everyday life.
Yeah. No, I agree. But you can the same point, we can completely understand why Life magazine and other newspaper journals that had lovely sketches of Basilone standing there behind a pile of spent cases and jungles and dead Japanese in the background, that stirs the soul and maybe gets people to buy war bonds and work a bit harder, a little bit better than a guy sitting in a tarpaulin over a truck, looking at a little screen there and noting things down and using his slide rule. One story kind of stirs the soul. The other one, as we've found out, clearly incredibly important, but maybe doesn't have that kind of PR element that would make it kind of spread. And I think that's the thing that my takeaway from this. One more question, then we will things, and it's from the Great Dominion. You covered this a little bit, but where was McDowell trained in radar operations? How many others had equal expertise at this point in the war? Was he individually, I guess, indispensable in the situation? Was it just a bit of a providence that someone so good was the guy who was there?
Well, the first group of people trained in the radar secret included McDowell.
Right.
The initial people chosen for radar were the best available people. It took a while to figure out how to train the average person to use radar. So they picked the best that they could. They learned the British way, which was, third-rate equipment with first-rate people. Well, the Americans had a different idea about how to do radar, but it took a while to get the mass production on the people side working. Right. So was he indispensable for this campaign? Yes. Yeah. There was another radar operator who couldn't get past any of those weaknesses of the radar, but McDowell did. And the weapon of the Marine is not as important as the Marine because his brain is the weapon.
Yeah.
Brasilo knew how to use machine guns well. Well, McDowell knew how to use radar well, and his contribution was decisive for air superiority. This is how close things were.
His intelligence in this sense was a force multiplier, way beyond his own individual. The wage he was drawing from the U.S. Marine Corps was being well spent.
Yes,
the return he was giving it. I'm not saying Basilone's wasn't well spent, but it's comparing apples and oranges in this sense, isn't it? And I like to think we are at the point in our study of World War II collectively where we can kind of push back the grass, as you brought up grass in your elephant metaphor, and start looking for the other stories there and not just repeating. Although I did a show on Basilone myself a few weeks ago because
it was a good one.
You have to mix the popular with not the popular, the well-known with the lesser well-known for balance. I mean, that's what I'm trying to do. Like if I did week after week of just technical stuff, I wouldn't have the viewers. And likewise, it's aviation 1 week, ground battles 1 week, and I'm going to try and get through the entire Battle of the Bulge 3 weeks in December without really mentioning the 101st Airborne, just because I feel it's kind of been covered up. It's bound to come into the conversation somewhere, but you know what I mean. It's trying to give people what they want and also give people what they should want, but they don't know they want it until you give it to them, kind of thing.
You got to market the way you market, Paul. Yeah. You're doing wonderful.
Well, thank you. Well, we will bring things to an end. I mean, it's extraordinary listening to you. And people have said there, did you write a book? You haven't yet, but you should do. And you and the 22 group should get out there and get this stuff out there. And we said last time, I think the popular historians, I don't really like that term, but those that are tackling these campaigns on a kind of an operational or even kind of theater level need to start using the expertise of people like yourself and the experts and all these other individual subjects, because as you said about the importance of the internet and people getting together and sharing information, there are people doing incredible work studying small aspects of something, and the big historians can't know it all themselves. So I think it's time to kind of go to these people and say, okay, I'm going to do a chapter about this. Can you point me in the right direction? Can you make sure I'm getting in all the names there? So, I would like to think the Ian W. Tolls and the James Scotts and the James Hollands and those people would contact people like yourself if they're talking about it and say, look, fill me in, check my writing. If there's anything I'm missing there, make sure it's in, because it's important to keep on learning this. But anyway, we will bring things to an end. So I will just remind people what you're coming up, and I'll say goodbye in a second. So folks, tomorrow evening we have Ben Kite is coming on. Remember, he was with us in Battle of Britain Week, talking about the lessons learned from the Battle of Britain. He is tackling the Royal Australian Air Force in the Pacific, which is one of the chapters of the second volume of his incredible book about the Royal Air Force. The links will be in the description tomorrow about that. So that's Ben Kite. And then Thursday, we're talking about the Douglas Dauntless. And then we have got a show with John McManus on Saturday, which is essentially about his island hopping book, which has just come out, the second volume of his Pacific trilogy. But we're also going to be tackling aviation because it is Aviation Week, and it was an excuse to bring John McManus on. So we're kind of doing a bit of aviation stuff while we also talk about island hopping. But right now, Again, thank you very much, Trent Zelenko, for joining us. You will definitely be extended another invitation to return on another subject at some point where we'll think about that, put our heads together. But yeah, thank you for doing this, and I hope you don't show any symptoms. And did you enjoy it?
I thought it was wonderful. I'm glad I could keep it up to slightly over an hour.
Yeah, no, it was what you were worried. It was really good. So really effective use of time. So folks, this is Paul Woodard for World War II TV. I will see you all again tomorrow. Thank you very much for your time today. It's been, as I always say, it would be pointless if it was just me and Trent talking to ourselves. Cheers, everybody. Bye.